So supposedly Ernest Hemingway said, even though he didn't really say, he said, write drunk and edit sober. We're going to have a wonderful social experiment this morning because we prepared this speech last night drunk, but we're speaking mostly sober today. Terry and I are in the process of writing a book called Love, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And the way that we write is a lot like maybe Jack Kerouac meets Jerry Garcia with a little bit of Frederick Hayek. We're going to let this thing sort of emerge spontaneously, and you guys have to bear through the whole thing. And we'll notice if you leave, so please stay till the end. With that, let me introduce Terry Kibbe. She is the CEO of Free the People. She is my wife, and she is my boss, but I repeat myself.
So Matt and I have been married for a long time. We'll see if our marriage survives writing a book together and giving keynote talks. So we met in 1982. I was a freshman in college. Now this is the dark ages. There was no internet. Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. No cell phones, right? No dating apps. So no groups like this, no groups like Students for Liberty where you could meet like-minded people. So we had to meet the old-fashioned way at a fraternity party.
Drunk.
Drinking beer. There's a theme. Beer will pop up a lot. So we met in 1982. He didn't get up the courage to ask me out until 1983. It's a bit of a sordid story. He had asked a few girls out for his fraternity's formal. They turned him down, twice. So he was scrolling through the phone book, asking somebody what my last name was. He remembered meeting me. Couldn't remember my name. Needed a last name because he looked me up in the phone book, right? Couldn't find me on WhatsApp. Couldn't find me on Tinder. I would have swiped left anyway, so it was probably bad. Sorry.
By the way, sidebar. For libertarian men in the audience, the economics of getting a girl to say yes involves asking enough people. Because the probability is eventually somebody with asymmetrical information is going to foolishly say yes, and her name was Terry.
Emphasis on foolish. So he asked me out, I say yes. I should note that I had other options and I chose him because he was really the lesser of two evils. It had nothing to do with him, but I liked his fraternity better than the other one. So we started dating. We got serious pretty quickly, dated all through college. When we first started to date, he switched his major. He had been a biology major, didn't like it very much. He's kind of stubborn, so he was kind of flunking out. When we started to date, he had just switched his major to economics and found his passion. His grades went from C's and D's to A's and B's. I was an engineering major. His parents, foolishly, gave me full credit for turning their son around. Had nothing to do with me. It was because he found his passion. So his grades improved. I never disavowed them of the fact that I was not the perfect person they thought I was. So we dated through college. He graduated. I was going back for my senior year. And we knew that we were spending our future together. But what was that going to look like? That was the question. So the question, right? Matt was faced with the question. And he wasn't going to say, will you marry me? Not him. What he said was, do you really need the government to sanctify our relationship? Do you really need that piece of paper, that marriage license? And I said, no, but Grandma. I have an Irish Catholic grandmother. She was never going to live with us, letting us live together without that piece of paper. So in the first of many compromises in our marriage, Matt agreed, bought a ring, and signed up for a marriage license.
It was a slippery slope. The first fundamental violation of my principles, I agreed to get married. I agreed to get the government to give me a license. And if you dig around a little bit in the economics and the history of marriage, you discover that it wasn't always the case that the government was involved, that marriage, perhaps the most important social institution from an economic and social and structural way, the way that it holds families together, the way that it is a basis for economic exchange, all of these things are pretty fundamentally important, but it used to be about economics. Back in the day, way back, A marriage was really a merger of two families, two enterprises, an exchange of goods and services, sometimes literally. And the goal was to produce enough kids to farm and survive in a subsistence world, right? At some point, because of free market capitalism, because of the rule of law, because of all the things we're going to talk about at this conference, marriage became something else. It became the ultimate luxury good, because at some point it wasn't just an economic question about whether or not you should get married. You could actually get married for love. Think about that, the ultimate luxury good because of capitalism. You could choose love. But of course, the government came along and they started licensing things. If you Google marriage licenses, you will quickly learn that places like apartheid South Africa made it illegal for people of different races to get married. One of the first legislation they passed when the apartheid government took over in 1947. In the United States, until a Supreme Court ruling in 1967, there were states where the government decided that you couldn't marry a person of a different race. So the marriage license was really a way to manipulate and engineer and redesign things, part of the progressive era in our country where there was this gross arrogance that the government was going to design everything, including who we could marry. That's offensive. And that, to me, is something that we should think about today when we struggle with questions about whether or not the government should legalize this kind of marriage or that kind of marriage. I would suggest that the ultimate authority is not that politician, but perhaps grandma. Grandma knows best. And by the way, you don't mess with grandma because the hammer comes down, you're done.
So we got married in 1986. Matt was in graduate school, studying for his PhD in economics at George Mason University. I was working as an engineer. We didn't have a lot of money, kind of as another theme of our life. But Matt got invited to attend a Mises seminar at the Stanford University in California, and we jumped at the opportunity. We were really excited. It gave us a great opportunity to go to California, have some of our expenses paid. We got to hear amazing speakers. And we had a transformational evening one night. We were sitting at a picnic table outside on campus and having a beer with Murray Rothbard. And so yes, Murray Rothbard, it was pretty amazing. Matt's been a fanboy, read everything. He was so excited, but he was also really excited about the beer that he was drinking, because it was Anchor Steam Brewing. Anchor Steam is an old, iconic brand, but it was also one of the very first craft breweries in the United States. And we had never had beer like this before. We'd been used to drinking Stroh's and Bud Light, things that really didn't taste like beer that Chris Lingle would like, because it doesn't taste like beer, it's really like water. So we had this amazing, iconic beer while having this conversation with Murray Rothbard. It was truly, truly a life-changing moment for both of us. And it started us down a path of seeking out really interesting beers through our life. A few years later, we were at our first Grateful Dead concert, the first of about 100 or so, I think. He doesn't do anything half-measured. So we're in a parking lot in Washington, D.C. If you've never been to a Grateful Dead concert, the parking lot scene is truly amazing. It's spontaneous order at its best. Markets spring up, transactions are made, you can buy just about anything, including beer. Some very enterprising hippie had loaded up his VW bus with Sierra Nevada brewing from California, which you couldn't get anywhere but California. You couldn't ship it, you couldn't find it. Again, a transformational moment, but it showed how markets work, how people can bring goods to you, right? Regardless of regulations, there's always a way around to get people what they want. So then, fast forward a bit, we started doing our vacations, following the Grateful Dead, partly to listen to the music, partly to find the new beers that were in the parking lot. I probably would have preferred beach vacations, but every once in a while the Dead would play in a beach town where there was good beer. So it kind of worked out.
She just suggested that she will meet me halfway on these things, and wives typically will tell you that, right? But there's some magic thing that they do where you think that you have agency, you think that you have free will, but ultimately let's be honest, a marriage is not a partnership. A marriage is just beautiful, right? And one of the things she puts up with is I am prone to quoting Austrian economists, one of my favorite economists.
I'm going to just stop you right now.
I'm going to keep going.
Go ahead.
Ludwig von Mises. Any Mises fans in here? Anyone not know who Ludwig von Mises is? This is your reading assignment. You got to check out some Mises. Mises talks about entrepreneurship. And to him, entrepreneurship wasn't just about coming up with a marginally more efficient way to produce widgets so that you could make a slightly better profit by serving more customers. That actually has nothing to do with entrepreneurship. He talked about it in a way that the entrepreneur is the guy that everybody laughs at because he's thinking about something that doesn't exist. He's thinking about some imaginary future that's better and more beautiful, like craft beer. Not that stuff you were drinking last night. Ugh. Craft beer and that Anchor steam that we were drinking with Murray Rothbard, that was created by a guy named Fritz Maytag.
And I'm interrupting you. Oh. So I had a really interesting experience. I had mentioned I was working as an engineer, and then I realized that Matt was having a lot more fun working in the marketplace of ideas. So I had a career change. I left engineering. I had a couple jobs, and then I ended up working at the Cato Institute, right? Which was an amazing opportunity. I was a director of development there. And it was while I was working at Cato that I actually got to meet Fritz Maytag. He was a supporter of the Institute. He's a big libertarian. So this amazing colliding of my worlds, right? My job and my beer. I got to go on a donor meeting, talk about libertarian ideas with Fritz while drinking his beer. It was truly fantastic.
By the way, it's not an accident that a libertarian entrepreneur who is considered the founding father of American craft beer shares the same values that we're talking about at this conference. But it wasn't always that case. Fritz Maytag was the son of the family that created Maytag washing machines. So an iconic family brand, a very successful family. And his family hated the fact that he bought this failing brewery called Anchor Steam. They sort of disowned him. It's the late 1970s. We have stagflation and Jimmy Carter economics going on. He almost goes out of business because he's just really passionate about making beer. And nobody drinks this kind of beer in the US. So he's sinking all of his money into this enterprise. He finds himself collapsed on the floor of the brewery. It wasn't a heart attack, it was just a panic attack because he didn't think he could make it. But that's what an entrepreneur is. An entrepreneur does something that no one, perhaps, believes in until that day. Fast forward some 15 years later, we're sitting at a park bench, picnic table with Murray Rothbard drinking this beer. And talking about the rational ass equidistance between two stacks of hay. Murray Rothbard, beer, Murray Rothbard. I don't know what to do. Sierra Nevada, a guy named Ken Grossman was mentored by Fritz Maytag. And has anyone ever had a Sierra Nevada? Is that a thing here? It's a very big brand in the US. It's now, Ken Grossman is now a billionaire. But back in the day, he started homebrewing before it was legal in the US. And he would actually drive across the border from Chico, California to Yakima, Washington and smuggle hops. These new experimental hops called Cascade. He would smuggle them back, and he was just passionate about it as well. And he sunk his personal fortune into a homebrewing thing. But the important thing about it was at that moment, there was legislation that legalized homebrewing and other legislation at the state level that legalized your right as a brewer to sell directly to customers. Beer to us is a perfect metaphor for freedom. Because if you're a young craft brewer today in virtually any country, you will discover very quickly that there are regulatory barriers to you being an entrepreneur. There's probably collusion between the beer industrial complex, the people that make that awful beer that Chris Lingle loves so much, and big government. That might be a lesson for people that love beer but are perhaps flirting with socialism. I don't know.
So marriage isn't always sunshine and beer and Grateful Dead concerts, as much as we'd like to think that it would be. So in 2001, I'm at home, Matt gives me a call, and in his very understated way says, "Terry, I have a problem." Well, that problem was that he had just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He had a tumor the size of a small football in his abdomen. It was a pretty rough time for us. We had about a month to kind of prepare. He was going in for major surgery. We didn't know what was going to happen. We had to get our affairs in order to make sure that I would be okay if he didn't make it. We had the talk, the talk that said that I would move on. If he died, I would agree to date someone else. I did agree, however, not to bring a date to the funeral, because we thought that might just be tacky. I was also concerned because we had 3 cats, Rourke, Ragnar, and Reardon. And if he died, I'd be a widow with 3 cats. So the possibility of getting a date was actually pretty grim at that point. But we persevered. We made it through. He went in for surgery. It was a grueling day. He's in the operating room for about 8 hours. And we honestly didn't know. There was a chance that he wasn't going to make it through that day. But he did. The doctor came out after
spoiler, I made it.
So the doctor comes out after 8 hours of surgery, and he says, "Congratulations. I have really good news. We couldn't take the tumor out. It was so big. Taking it out would have just been too disruptive to his system. But it's a tumor, it's a cancer that we can cure." So we knew that there was hope. It certainly wasn't easy. It was a very rare type of cancer. They convened what they call a tumor board. They called in the best doctors from around the country to figure out the best chemotherapy regimen for him. But luckily, there was actually something that worked.
So one of the cool things about getting stage 4 cancer, and let me repeat that, one of the cool things about getting stage 4 cancer is that you realize at a fairly young age that you're not going to live forever. And you become a little bit impatient about things and people and bureaucracy that wants to hold you back if you're trying to accomplish something in your life. So in a weird way, getting cancer was perhaps the most liberating thing that happened to me. But in the meantime, I had to actually survive. And cancer, and my cancer in particular, is a fairly grueling process. 6 months of chemotherapy. Chemo, of course, is a poison that you inject into your body. And it's like carpet bombing your body. It's not just going to go after cancer cells. If you're lucky, it goes after cancer cells, but it goes after everything else. It destroys your red blood cells and your white blood cells. And of course, everyone knows you lose your hair and you lose your energy. And it's a pretty miserable experience. When I was going through cancer, I had a cornucopia of drugs. I had everything you could imagine to offset the damage done by the last thing. And it's just an ongoing process of taking this to offset that, to take this and that. Plenty of opioids. The one thing the government wouldn't let me do was try medical cannabis. I'm not sure why. I have stage 4 cancer, and I felt like if I could take all those opioids to offset some of the pain and the suffering, I'm not sure weed is going to be a devastating experience, but the government wouldn't let me do that. And interestingly enough, the drug that saved my life, it's a therapy called etoposide. And me being the economics dork that I was, I'm sitting there, I'm doing chemotherapy, so I'm researching the drugs that I'm taking. And it turns out that etoposide had only recently been approved by the Federal Drug Administration in the United States. So it would have been possible, just 10 years before I was diagnosed, that the government would have told me that there is this therapy that we know works. It's now 20 years old, in the process of getting approved by the FDA, but you can't take it. We just had this debate in the United States. Donald Trump just signed into law some fairly modest right to try legislation. Every single Democrat in the Senate voted against the right to try for cancer patients like me because the logic was terminal patients might make a mistake, and if they make a mistake, they might die. This is how the government thinks about healthcare. I prefer, radically, to consider the idea that patients and doctors and wives, maybe we could make those decisions. I could make that decision about cannabis, and I could make that decision about an experimental treatment that might save my life. Is that radical? Maybe.
All right, so we're going to stay in the hospital. Sorry, it's a little bit depressing, but we'll get out of there soon, I promise. So about 5 years ago, my mother was very ill. She was suffering from a lot of things, including congestive heart failure. She was going in and out of lucidity. Matt and I were spending the day with her in the hospital. And she was having a good moment, and she looked at me and she said, "So what book are you reading now?" My mother and I read a lot together growing up, so we would always discuss the books that we were reading. So she asked me this question, and my first thought, which luckily I kept to myself, was, shit. And that's because I was reading a book called Crossings, written by Deirdre McCluskey. The book tells the story of Deirdre's transition from Donald McCluskey to Deirdre McCluskey.
So actually, when I was in graduate school at George Mason University, my mentor was an Austrian economist named Don Lavoie, and he brought Donald McCluskey, who was at the time at the University of Iowa. He'd just written a book called The Rhetoric of Economics. If you want to read a book that's essential to what we're talking about today, read the Rhetoric of Economics by Donald McCluskey. Honestly, the first time I met Deirdre, I didn't know what to do. It was awkward. I was uncomfortable, but we figured it out.
So I got to know Deirdre well, traveling through Europe with Barbara here on the Free Market Roadshow, and Chris as well. So we would sit around, usually on the train. Barbara didn't allow very much spare time on the Free Market Roadshow, so the conversations usually happened on trains. So Deirdre was talking about her experience. Her transition was in 1994. It wasn't easy. It took 5 years. She had to travel to Europe for the surgeries. She was married at the time, had 2 children. She lost her family during all of this. Her sister had her institutionalized twice to try to stop her from having this transition occur. So this brings me back to my mother. She's 86 years old, she's Catholic. She's dying. I didn't realize it at the time. But this was actually the last conversation that I ever had with my mother. And it was about Deirdre and what she had gone through, what she had given up, the struggles that she did. And I didn't know how my mom was going to take it, right? I had briefly thought about making up some fluffy fiction book because I didn't really want to get into such a deep topic with my mom. But it's mom, so I couldn't lie, right? So we have this conversation. She's listening and she's asking questions. It's very personal. I mean, Deirdre is a friend of mine. And my mother, thinking about it, and she then says, wow, it must have really meant a lot to her. It must have been so important for her to give up so much to become the person that she felt that she needed to be.
So the takeaway, grandma's opinion matters, mom's opinion matters, but when you personalize the story about Deirdre, take it outside of politics, take it outside of the tribal warfare that we're having in our country. I'm sure this is going on across the globe about identity and intersectionality and this complex matrix that central planners would like to establish that says that based on your ethnicity or your sexual preferences or who your parents were or where you live or fill in the blank. We're going to create this complex matrix by which we decide whether or not you're a good person. Well, I don't trust any of those guys. I don't trust a single politician to decide whether or not you and I are good people. I think we could figure that out. And the lesson for Terry's mom was that it was a personal story. It wasn't a theoretical debate. It It wasn't a piece of legislation. It wasn't a sign on a bathroom door. It was about a person. And as people trying to figure stuff out in all of these complex arguments that we have about social interaction and economics and how we structure society, if we talk to each other as people and have a personal story, at very least, you can muster up a little bit of tolerance, a little bit of empathy. They're not the other anymore. They're one of us. And that ugly, complex, beautiful process by which free people figure stuff out, that's the only way to get there with this stuff. It's also, I think, perhaps the only way that we're going to be able to convince people that are skeptical of markets and freedom that there's something beautiful about what happens when people are free to do beautiful things.
Our newly elected, well, one of our newly elected congresswomen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a self-avowed democratic socialist, says, "It's better to be morally right than factually correct." So the other side, when they try to persuade people, they talk about morals and they talk about people and they tell stories. And at the very end, they'll say, well, that's why we need socialized medicine. But they've already spent 20 minutes talking about that little girl that died because she didn't have access to the medical care that she needed. Their ideas, their policy changes are really just a throwaway. Our side, I think we tend to lead with facts and figures and spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. And I don't think that's how you persuade people. I think that we are both morally right and factually correct, but that we need to focus more on the morally right part rather than the facts.
So we all laughed when Ocasio-Cortez says that, right? But I actually think she's right. I think it's more important to be morally right than factually correct when you're trying to persuade people about what you believe and how we could lift people up, how we could lift people out of poverty, how we could create opportunity, how we could create a world that was more tolerant. But in this era of storytelling and technology and video and a lot of the things that we work on at Free the People, we finally have the upper hand. They always had us with that emotionally compelling story. They always beat us on that front. But what if you had, as Terry just said, the story and the facts? That's a potent weapon. That's an opportunity to get people to think beyond their pre-existing prejudices about why markets don't work and start imagining a world where we can actually achieve a lot of the same goals that we share with our friends on the left. We just have the facts on our side.
And I think with that, we are done. I am, however, going to make one quick plug for the work that we do at Free the People. We focus on video storytelling. And there's one video that we've done that I'm pretty proud of. And it, of course, is about beer. I know you're surprised. We got to put together a really great collaboration between a crazy brewer in Belgrade, Serbia named Vladimir and a very libertarian brewer in the United States, Jim Caruso of Flying Dog. And they made a great beer called Flying Dogma. And we did a video about it. It's a story about beer. People watching it just think it's this crazy brewer in Belgrade talking about hops and things like that. But it's really a story about trade and entrepreneurship and cooperation. So I suggest that you go onto YouTube and find the Free the People channel and check out that's one of my favorite videos, but there's a lot there. So with that, we are actually right on time. We have 10 minutes for questions. I can't get the Whova app, so
I got it right here.
Do you have it?
I got it.